Mateen. Our third recommendation talks about creator stronger funding models with longer time horizons, more flexible structures, and better coordination. So I'll translate that to fewer shiny apps, more people talking to each other, which I think you'd be a great candidate to champion. So with your portfolio as a funder, you work with academia and social impact teams to create digital public goods, right? Things we can all, contribute to and benefit from, creating collaborative, interoperable, and open systems to prevent these one-off and siloed projects. So how do you think about funding this work differently? On a panel last week in Switzerland, we heard, some funders talking about, agile internal teams shaping the way they work. What kind of capabilities do you have to have in-house now? Or what kind of mindsets do you have to have in-house now? And what lessons can you share with our funder audience? Thanks, Bilal.
So it's a brilliant question, Perry. And I think that if I'm going to be honest, I'd love to say that we have some profoundly different playbook by which we fund digital public goods for science and health research and just more broadly. But if I'm very honest with you, I don't, at least not yet. I think it's a process of continual learning, and there's been some hard-won lessons that have resulted in some step changes in our behavior at Wellcome, I think the funding community at large. And that's what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few reflections on what some of those step changes have been, and hopefully you'll realize that they're not profound, but they've had quite a substantial impact on the value of our work. And it starts with doing your homework, being intentional about landscaping what the field looks like, what's already been done, how we don't duplicate. And I think that speaks to our ambition of wanting to be more than just a checkbook as a funder. We want to be a valuable partner that co-develops this work, that has something useful to contribute to the end goal and the ambition. But more importantly, I think we're all a little bit guilty of having built the same thing multiple times and given groups money to build very similar things without realizing it. There's one example that got used very often when I first joined, where we'd given a grant to build the exact same thing 3 times before someone else realized. And it wasn't even one of the funding teams. It was someone in our enterprise digital technology team who had seen the same grant come through the system. So I think we're all guilty of it. And to make sure we're using our capital judiciously, there's this need to do our homework up front. And I don't think that's unique to tech funding, but rather funding as a whole. But it's been critical to making us more effective in how we leverage the dollars that we have. I think in terms of capabilities, I love the agile argument. I will simplify it even further. We've done this with science research for decades. We had folks with PhDs in neuroscience looking after our neuroscience portfolio. We have people with lived experience of mental health conditions involved in our mental health funding. Why do we not have a cohort of tech generalists that are sat at that table helping us fund digital public goods? Some funders moving in that direction. I don't think we're seeing it across the board, and I'd love to see it more. Because if you're going to set reasonable expectations with your grantees, if you're going to be able to go back to senior leadership and say, you know what, it does actually cost this much to build this thing, you need to have seen what a software research engineer gets paid. You need to have written a line of code to understand the complexities of that process. And thus, I really think we need those generalists in the room. And the beauty of this is those people need to come from somewhere. And there's this neat little virtuous cycle you create by investing in capacity strengthening, right? It's the unintended benefit of minting the next generation of professional philanthropists that help drive the innovative funding. I came from somewhere. I have a data science background. I'm a clinician. I never thought I would go into funding and philanthropy in this space. But because the opportunities existed, when the job presented itself, I could, right? So I think there's the unintended benefit of us just trying to help strengthen the ecosystem as a whole. And then there's just recognizing and centering the differences between tech and hypothesis-driven research, right? When you have a wet lab experiment, you can pay for it. You don't really need to think about the maintenance of that experiment for the next 40, 50 years. It's just fundamentally different, right? Results are done, they're published. There's the ongoing issue of archiving of the data, but with foundational tech and training, you literally have to pay for someone to maintain that. And we don't have good models of sustainability in the DPG landscape, right? We've got a handful of tools. Some of them have reached cost neutrality. Each looks a little bit different, and we don't know what's reproducible. And I think it comes back to this, the real mindset shift is just getting comfortable with the fact that there's uncertainty, there's a risk of failure, and we've got to be willing to pay for that experimentation. For some reason, we're very okay with it when it's hypothesis-driven research, right? If the research fails to give you the answer you're looking for, that's okay. There are a couple caveats I'll add, but I think we need to get a lot more comfortable with paying for big tech projects recognizing there's a risk there. It may not work, but it's worth the risk.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I'm reminded of the XKCD cartoon with everything depending on one single line of code. And I think a lot of our projects suffer from that, how do we maintain that core infrastructure and think about it? And having spent a little bit of time on your side of the table, one of the things that does strike me is that need for tech generalists of how do you think about maybe a dashboard for cities isn't structurally code-wise that different than a dashboard for climate change or a dashboard for, public health. But when the teams are siloed, it's hard to bridge that gap. So thanks for the hard work you're doing to bring that not only across different philanthropies, but also within large philanthropies themselves. I know it can be challenging.